Hi everyone, today's mini lesson is going to continue our conversation about the conditions under the Progressive Era. Today we're going to specifically focus on talking about the conditions within the workplace. So the first slide is going to focus on the conditions for everyone, like adults, and then the second one's going to focus specifically on children. So we've talked a little bit about this in the past as we were talking about urbanization and the need for labor unions and things like that. However, you need to keep in mind that these conditions were continuing into the same era we've been talking about. So prior to the development of the labor unions, the hours were very long. People were working 10 to 12 hours, often almost all, if not all, days of the week. There were unsafe working conditions, which included deadly accidents. This included things like fires or accidents with machinery. The tasks were very repetitive, and they had developed different models in order to increase production, and consequently, people got really bored really quickly because they were doing the same exact thing all day, every day. There was a lot of unprotected machinery that often led to limbs being cut off as people were basically getting stuck in these machines. So before I go over the notes for child labor, NBC did a really quick special a couple years back on the child labor condition. So I want you to watch and listen about it, and then I'll talk more about it in a second.
The 1900 census reported that nearly 2 million children were working, making up 6% of America's labor force. Children as young as 5 contributed wages to the family income. And many child laborers faced unhealthy or dangerous working conditions that often left them sick, injured, or deformed.
Children were working in the fields, and I'm talking about black children, white children, immigrant children, were working in cotton fields, in blueberry patches, in canning factories, in coal mines. They were sitting in coal shafts, controlling elevators for 12 hours a day at the age of 10 or 11.
Progressive reformers became alarmed at the growing number of child workers. They formed organizations in the early 1900s devoted to the healthy development of children. One of those organizations, the National Child Labor Committee, hired Louis Wicks Hine to photograph children at work and to expose their harsh conditions. Hine's images brought national attention to the difficult life of millions of children. Over the next 20 years, the NCLC and other organizations investigated child labor abuses and continued to push for state legislation that would take children out of the workforce and put them in schools. Finally, by 1929, every state had restrictions preventing children under 14 from working. But national legislation against child labor would take another decade because business and industry continued to oppose it.
In fact, one of the major reasons that national legislation about child labor didn't make it past the Supreme Court until 1938, I mean, it's unbelievable to us that there was no federal legislation against child labor until almost 1940, was because essentially the Southern cotton interests and Midwestern coal, iron, steel interests combined to fight this legislation to stop child labor.
In 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which restricted child labor and continues to protect workers to this day.
Okay, so that gave you a little bit of a background. I want to make sure that we have notes on this as well. So in terms of the child labor aspect, like it mentioned, there were no regulations of available jobs, so kids could really work any job that an employer was willing to allow them to work. They had unlimited work hours, so kids were not going to school. They were working all day, every day. The conditions were really harsh, and there was no federal or state regulations to control it. The factories that they were often working in were crowded and unclean. They paid considerably less to children. They were less likely to unionize. A lot of kids didn't even know what a union was, let alone how to join it or how to fight for their rights. Because they were working all day, every day, they were unable to attend school. Consequently, this often continued the trend of poverty where kids wouldn't go to school and then they'd grow up and they wouldn't have a strong education. And because they didn't have a strong education, they could only work minimum jobs. And because they were limited on the jobs that they could work, they could never really improve their lifestyle. This continued until the Great Depression, so you'll hear me talk about this a little bit more in the future as well. So overall, harsh working conditions, definitely things that people wanted to come together and have a discussion about. Unions definitely helped. Different regulations from the state and the federal government helped. But as you saw in that video, it took a considerable amount of time before everything kind of fell in line and the federal government caught up with the state government's regulations.